Video 10, Run Through the Fed System. I'm Rick Nichols. I wrote a book titled Make America Financially Great. This book is based on 15 years of research that included the 1913 Federal Reserve Act and the 1864 National Currency Act. I'm going to go over the concepts created in the 1913 Federal Reserve Act that aren't appreciated by professors and then run through the system. Here is the first concept. The Federal Reserve System was established as a government-sponsored enterprise, which means that non-government people and their privately owned corporations get government power, and they use that government power to make a profit and pass it along to their buddies. That also means that citizens are not represented in the decisions that the Federal Reserve System makes about money. Thereby, we are enslaved to follow the decisions of non-government people. The second concept, elastic currency. Elastic currency is checking account balances. Two checking account systems were created in the 1913 Federal Reserve Act. System 1, transferable deposit legal tender fiat checking account system. Legal tender checking for short. This is the system we citizens use. System 2, Fed funds lawful money reserve checking account system. Reserve checking for short. This is the reserves in the Federal Reserve System. These two checking account systems converted the US dollar from gold as money to elastic currency as money. Checking account balances are transferred from account to account just like a gold coin is passed from hand to hand in the normal transactions of life. Essentially, both checking accounts are simple scorekeeping systems that were given congressional authorization to function as fiat money, although Congress didn't realize they authorized fiat money. First, legal tender checking was created by establishing three types of accounts: checkings, savings, and investment. Then the banks were required to accept account balance transfers between banks. That authorization converted bank accounts into legal tender fiat money. The second system, reserve checking, was taken from clearinghouse certificates established in the 1864 National Currency Act. This was in the days that gold was money. As checks were cashed by different banks, the gold had to be transported to the different bank. The clearinghouse certificate was used to represent the movement of gold. The main point today is that clearinghouse certificates were authorized by Congress to function as lawful money. When the Jekyll Island financial bad guys wrote the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, they took clearinghouse certificates and converted them into the reserve checking system. What they wanted is the lawful money authorization. They needed that fiat authorization to buy Treasury Bonds from Congress. Third concept, monopoly. The financial bad guys wanted to be the first to buy all the Treasury Bonds. To do so, they created a monopoly, so they are the only ones to have access to the U.S. Treasury to buy Treasury Bonds. They created the monopoly by only allowing 5 Federal Reserve Bank corporations to file a Comptroller of Currency Certificate of Organization, which is needed to have access to the U.S. Treasury to buy bonds. I refer to these top Federal Reserve banks as the 5 certificates. The Comptroller of Currency Certificate of Organization allows the 5 certificates to buy all the Treasury bonds by using a depositless deposit to Congress's Reserve Bank account. Congress would then issue checks to government vendors and employees who deposit the reserve system checks into the legal tender checking system, thereby increasing the M2 money inventory count, which causes inflation and increases the minimum wage. The fourth concept, free Fed notes. The question is, why do the financial bad guys want to be the only ones to buy Treasury bonds? There are two reasons. The first reason is because the 1913 Federal Reserve Act says that if they deposit the Treasury bond back into the Treasury, then the Treasury will give the financial bad guys free Fed notes. Absolutely true. The citizens of the United States are required by law to give the financial bad guys free Fed notes with each Treasury bond they buy with a depositless deposit, which means they get free Treasury bonds and free Fed notes. Now that's a great scam. This system was actually taken from the 1864 National Currency Act. The second reason to be the only ones to buy Treasury bonds is the paper money for gold franchise. The original financial bad guy scam was to loan paper money to a government but collect gold as repayment. Today, the financial bad guys buy Treasury bonds within the reserve checking system but get paid back by citizens in the legal tender system. With a balance in legal tender checking, they can buy anything for sale in the United States, with the presumption this includes a few politicians and judges. The last concept is the required reserve account. The neighborhood commercial banks and the 12 district Federal Reserve banks are required to keep a minimum balance in an account called required reserves. The neighborhood commercial bank buys required reserves from the 12 district reserve banks. This is called a discount. Then the 12 district reserve banks have to buy reserves from the 5 certificates reserve banks. This is called a rediscount. These banks must exchange a citizen's loan agreement to buy required reserves. The reason I have proclaimed the financial bad guys to be infinitely rich is based on required reserves. As the M2 money inventory count increases, then an increase in their required reserve account is needed. So, every time Congress accepts exchanging a Treasury bond for an account balance increase in its reserve checking account, it starts a chain reaction that ends up that all banks below the 5 certificates have to increase their required reserve account. Then these banks must exchange another citizen's loan agreement to buy more required reserves. The required reserves act as a conveyor belt that transports the citizen's loan agreement up to the 5 certificates. So the 5 certificates can collect the citizen's loan payment in the legal tender checking account system, thereby being able to buy anything for sale in the United States. Here is a quick rundown of the system. There are 5 players: Congress, the 5 certificates reserve banks, the 12 district reserve banks, the neighborhood commercial banks, the citizens as borrower. There are 2 systems, legal tender checking and reserve checking. There are 3 concepts: required reserves, discount, rediscount. There are 2 scams: monopoly access to the Treasury to buy Treasury bonds. Treasury bonds get free Fed notes. Here's the rundown. Congress has a budget deficit. Congress borrows with a Treasury bond. The 5 certificates buy all the Treasury bonds. They buy them with a depositless deposit to Congress's account in the reserve checking system. This increases the amount of reserves in the world. Congress then writes checks from the reserve checking system to pay government vendors and employees. The government vendors and employees deposit their checks in the legal tender checking account system. This has the effect of transferring the increased amount of reserves into legal tender checking. This causes an increase in the M2 money inventory. The increase in money inventory increases the neighborhood commercial bank's total balances. That forces the neighborhood commercial bank to increase its required reserve. The neighborhood commercial bank must exchange a loan agreement from a citizen for an increase in its required reserve account at one of the 12 district reserve banks. The exchange is called a discount. The district reserve bank transfers reserves from its required reserve account to the neighborhood commercial bank. This reduces the amount of reserves held by the district reserve bank. That means it must get more reserves. So it transfers the loan to the 5 certificates reserve banks. This exchange is called rediscount. The 5 certificates now own the loan agreement and will collect payment from the citizens in the legal tender checking system. They can now buy anything for sale in the U.S. with legal tender checking. Essentially, the 5 certificates loaned a checking account deposit on paper and collected legal tender. That's the purpose of the financial bad guys scam. Situational awareness. Once Congress is informed that coining new balances in reserve checking is the pivotal point, Congress can coin its own balances instead of borrowing from the financial bad guys. With the knowledge of how the Federal Reserve System actually works, Congress can take back the power it was conned out of in 1913. Since Congress represents citizens, then citizens are freed from enslavement from the decisions made by the financial bad guys. The financial bad guys now have less legal tender flowing into their bank accounts, which means they don't have the bank balance to transfer into their buddies' accounts, and therefore will have fewer politicians, judges, and Wall Street executives as buddies. Congress will free up over $1 billion per week that was going to the financial bad guys and reroute that $1 billion to citizens. Most importantly, after realizing that worthless fiat money made out of nothing is actually legal tender that is backed by everything for sale in the United States, the method to increase the value of U.S. dollars is to increase the quality and variety of products and services produced in the U.S. Congress can now concentrate on renewing manufacturing in the U.S. with modern, efficient, and environmentally friendly techniques. They can also provide more jobs to rebuild infrastructure in the United States. More jobs will reduce crimes, which will make citizens safer. Economic prosperity is found when America is financially great. Our problem is that America can't become financially great until professors of finance, economics, political science, and law give their approval. The reason this is a problem is because those professors aren't required to study the 1913 Federal Reserve Act document to become professors. Therefore, they don't have a baseline of knowledge to judge if my interpretations of the Act is correct information. Would you please help me persuade professors of finance, economics, political science, and law to work together to study the 1913 Federal Reserve Act document to understand it? I have provided a head start for their education. It is my book entitled Make America Financially Great. Thank you for listening to the research of a fellow United States of America citizen.